Hi class, Kevin Lewis here. I'm going to take us and do a little debugging for 138 using the PyCharm IDE that's set up on our VMs for MiraCosta. So here's the problem essentially of the input-output text. I have two an input and an output file. We have our input file here, which basically is the two numbers that we just did for homework 5. And then essentially that produces a single output file that has the sum of those two numbers output or that get output in the file. This problem kind of brought up quite a few different things for students and basically different ways of how to debug it and what we can see from the debugger. So when I was working through with students, a lot of students would basically on this problem is just use the print statement. So for example, after we open the file for the input and output, we want to read all the lines, and basically the result of this method call basically puts the lines in a list that then allows us to basically run through every line in the list and basically do some processing, which we see in the for loop here, which is basically taking the two numbers, splitting them up, and then adding in or taking the numbers, converting them from strings to integers, number 1, number 2. So then we do the addition here and basically output it to a file here. And then we do that for every line, which essentially is kind of the bulk of the work of the problem, is figuring that out. One easy way to kind of print this out and kind of just show you, Python has a lot of built-in methods. So for example, I could do print lines, which basically takes this list of lines and allows it to be printed out. So if I click here and run it, what we should see is on the output is you'll see that that list gets printed out down here. One thing, since we're running on Windows, Linux is maybe a little different, is you might not see these new line characters, but essentially that just basically means that there's a enter at the end of the character. And the split won't even look at it because it's not a space, which is the default behavior. And it will just skip that over. So from this, we can just get a list of all the items that will run through in this thing. And then furthermore, if we could actually do a print down here called line, which we'll see this list get printed out, and then we'll also see each line get printed out that way. So you'll see there's the list, and then there's our printouts of each line that we want to go through that way. There's a few students who I work through with this is kind of using the debugger, which is another way that we could debug our problems and actually understand it. One thing that you do need to set up for using the debugger is you want to basically put one of these red dots here, which basically is called a breakpoint. And this basically tells Python that as it's running the code, if it hits this line of code, to basically stop the processing and basically then continue on from there as we go through that. So instead of using the run button here, we're going to actually use the debugger button here, which is a little bug, and we're going to debug our program, is essentially get rid of the bugs in our program. So if I click there, one thing you'll notice is that we'll kind of start running it just as we are normally running it, but then it switches over to a different view. So we still have the console here, which basically, if you read this whole thing, it's running our Python file. But then we also have this awesome debugger thing. What we see here is that there's actually, when we're running through it, you get two different visual cues that things are happening. One is up here in the actual window of our code. You'll see that we have basically some additional text information, and this is what's happening behind the scenes and what's happening internally into Python. The files are a little bit different, so we won't go into exactly what all this means, But then if you look here, we also has a lines thing, which is a list, right? And it actually shows up all our variables here. And then down below, we also get all the variables here, and we can actually kind of traverse and see the information in that list. So if you click expand the little diagonal with a list, you can see that in slot 0, we have 78 and 60, 49 and 35 in slot 1, in slot 2, 1 and 1, which basically matches our input file that I have out here. So going back to this Python, we can then basically use the debugging tool to basically step through our code and examine what's happening through every step of our code. Now there's two basic ways to step through it. I'm just going to go over the step over method. Step into is once we get into methods and classes that allows you to actually go from one file into a different file or a different part of the process. With the step over, we're just going to basically allow us to execute the next line of code. So if I click over the step over, you'll notice that this line of code that we're on, it's going to basically move the execution from it will execute this line 7 here and move us to line 8. So if I hit step over, you'll notice that it moved us from here to here, and then you can see here that it actually assigned the variable line the value of 7860, which is the first element from our list in here. And then as we go through, it will actually execute this next thing. So on line, which is this value right here, we're going to split that and produce another list called numbers, which will again get created down here. The nice thing here is you can kind of see the different lines that get executed at different points in time as we go along. So when I hit the next variable step over, it executes the next thing, which basically produces another variable called numbers, which is another list, which then has the values, the string value 78 and the string value 60, which essentially matches also the variable down here, which we have 78 and 60, and a length of 2, which is the two numbers we split out. And then as we go through this and do our steps, we can actually see that this gets converted to an integer and put into number 1. So we click that, we can see number 1 equals 78, just as we can hear, and we see that now it's actually an integer 78 down here, which is what we needed to do so that we could do our addition on those two numbers. So again, 78, or sorry, number 1, which is 60, also gets converted to an integer, and then we can see those two numbers down here that get executed. This will then output it and print that out to the file. So if I actually go through and hit step over, we actually then go back to the top, and this actually got written out to the out file, which is our output right here. It's not going to show it immediately in our output here due to the fact that there's some buffering going on in the background with Python, but trust me that eventually it will get written out, especially on the close when we basically flush out the buffer. And then we can do this for the rest of the elements in the list by just going step over and pulling out the next each value and kind of running through that piece by piece. And again, this is a great way to kind of traverse your program and basically understand what's happening if you aren't quite getting the results. And this is a great way to do the debugging versus doing the print line, as you can actually kind of interactively run the program line by line and kind of see what's happening internally to the Python program and what the variables are. So hopefully that will help some people out with their homeworks from now on. Again, you can see all the values down here. Do make sure that when you're done, you either close it, or if you went too far, you can always rerun it from the beginning, which will take you back to the top and basically allow you to go stop. But one thing to remember is you do need to put one breakpoint in here. Otherwise, the debugger, if it doesn't have a breakpoint, will just run through it all and execute it. So you do need to put a breakpoint to tell Python that we need to stop the program at this line of code when we get to it. So that's what I wanted to show you guys, and hopefully this will be helpful. If you need any help with this or anything like that, again, feel free to email me or just let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out with different things. Okay, hopefully everyone has a good day, and talk to you later. Bye.